Hello everyone, and welcome to this 30th anniversary Edinburgh International Book Festival. And this event's sponsored by Tangent, who we have to thank for helping us out, and they also designed the brochure, I'm told. So tonight, as if you didn't know, we have a man not only honoured with Comics Awards, but so honoured the Queen had to give him a medal, Mr. Grant Morrison. Grant, you've got to a huge level internationally in comics now.
Meet the Queen.
Meet the Queen. I've got to ask, is she a fan? Does she read? Does she read the books? Is she a I've always seen her as maybe a Batman fan.
I think she'd be more into something like maybe Shade the Changeman and read the weird stuff. She likes that early Vertigo. No, the Queen actually wasn't there, so it was Charles himself, and he says, you do comic books? And, yeah, I do. And then he started talking about the Eagle. I used to love the Eagle. Damn. So, you know, I told you Dan Dare was a fascist.
I find it interesting, we're sitting here in Edinburgh. Of course, some of the earliest stuff you did, way before you got to the level you're now, was coming out in the old Edinburgh sci-fi bookshop. And it's near myths. Can you tell us a wee bit about the really earliest? I mean, that also brought in Brian Talbot was being published in that, and other folk.
Yeah, Brian Talbot was here, and I just want to say that Brian should constantly be recognised as one of the greatest innovators in not only British comics, but everything that followed the 70s. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, the days of near myths were quite interesting. It was back when King Harold was king. You remember him? The Normans had just invaded, and this guy Rob King had the idea to create near myths, which was the first ground level comic in Britain. And the idea of the ground level comics came from the West Coast in the 70s, where this guy Mike Friedrich, do you remember this at all? And he created something called Starreach. And honestly, basically all it was science fiction with tits. It was a simple formula, but it promised a lot. You know, it was the early attempts to create an adult comics scene based out of what we already understood. So it was kind of Howard Chaykin and those guys doing, as I say, you know, fantastic spaceships and then girls in stockings and high heels and tits. Everywhere in the universe you went, that's what they looked like. You know? So enlightened ideas had certainly spread through the galaxy. But this was the formula, and then Rob said, well, let's see if we can do something like this, which combines the kind of the black and white science fiction stuff with the kind of the mainstream sensibilities of Marvel superhero books and the kind of the cosmic stuff that was out at the time. Jim Starlin, Don McGregor, Steve Englehart, those people who were doing these fantastic kind of weird, hippie, philosophical Marvel comics in the early 70s. So I think they all grew out of these roots, and suddenly Rob said, can we do our own homegrown version of this? And again, it's something that ought to be remembered, because Scotland, again, was one of the first attempts to do something like this, and although there were much more successful things like Warrior later on, you know, Rob King and the whole team there deserve again a round of applause for Bobby King for actually trying to start up an adult comic in Britain. But honestly, of the meetings, all I can remember was these guys would just smoke dope constantly, and I was a super straight edge little mod. I'd turn up in my suit and I was really fucking disapproving. How dare you pull out my lungs with this vileness? But then I'd come out and I'd go to the chip shop and I was so, oh wow, chips. I never thought about chips like this before. So there was a kind of education in the whole thing, but seriously, it was just swimming with smoke, and they'd come up with all these mad ideas and implement them in the comic. And eventually Brian Talbot had to take over editing because of the sheer amount of swirling smoke that was sweeping through the near myths offices. Brian had to come in with a little bit of a whip and say, I'm taking over the book. But it was marvellous times, wonderful times back then, you know. Back in the good old days of the music hall and Pharaoh.
What you're saying basically is Dope and Chips is the first kind of transcendental experience for you. Is that the first mind-expanding consciousness?
Yeah, Dope and Chips is the title of my next autobiography.
There you go. There's a really good tip for everybody that's an aspiring writer out there.
Dope and Chips, yeah, you don't need a problem.
What is a when you're doing your writing, what's the kind of average writing day for you? Are you one of these?
Yeah, I'm
just
one of
write when you
them.
get the idea? Well, we know that, but you one of these guys that tries to stick to the office hours like some writers, or you only write when you get the ideas in your head, you've got to write it?
No, I've got so much to do, honestly, it's a non-stop job, and I like the job, so I kind of get up in the morning at 9 o'clock and I start working, and I just work all day until I'm fed up and Big Brother comes on.
How do you break up balancing the different series? You've always got quite a few plates that you're spinning at any one time. So how do you balance out which ones you're going to keep doing and manage the deadline?
They all have deadlines, but they're all kind of different approaches. So you kind of just spin it. You know, it's the one when you're doing Batman, which is very intricate kind of puzzle book thing. And then the next minute it's an action comics, which is just straightforward. Well, it wasn't straightforward for the last 5 issues, but it was intended to be a kind of straightforward physical comic. So they all have different feels, and you can sort of jump between them, and it keeps it interesting, keeps it vibrant.
I got the impression, I mean, just my reading of it, but when I was reading Batman Incorporated, I got the impression you were having a lot of fun doing that one. You can usually tell when someone's, will it be film, music, writing, you can always tell when somebody's having fun with it, and it really felt as if you were quite enjoying jumping around the world, having all these different Batman.
Oh, all that stuff was great, you know, and of course it's fun doing Batman. I think it always has to be remembered. You know, like there's nothing better than being Batman is than writing Batman, I think, and it's great fun, you know, and you can always come up with ideas for that character. And he's always interesting. It's a culturally important thing, you know, the fact that there are still Batman movies, the fact that people are excited to see Batman kicking the shit out of Superman.
Perhaps even more so now we've heard the new casting.
Well, exactly. He's going to chin him to death. Woo, I need a towel. Just after visiting Atlantis.
Talk of the Superman,
You've got a thing in your head.
I've got that to mop up as well.
So, yeah.
You're doing Action Comics. You got to reboot as part of the new 52.
Mm-hmm.
You got to. I mean, basically everything was being rebooted. But that must have given you a lot of leeway to redo. I mean, he's not the easiest character in some ways to do. I mean, he's practically a demigod. He's got all these powers. Suddenly you get taken back. And he's a kid in jeans and a homemade, cape.
Well, I just had this idea because people had kept complaining about Superman looks weird and why does he wear the pants and all those things. So I thought, well, what would happen if we just took all that away? Could we still have Superman? So I took the uniform away and thought, what looks like the uniform? Well, blue jeans and a t-shirt and just a daft cape around your neck would kind of fill in for the uniform. It would be the same colours, it would look a bit weird. And it was all about that. It was my idea saying, if we take away everything you hate about Superman, is there anything left that you like? And the jury's still out, I think.
That started off as, fair enough, here's a reboot, here's a young Superman, he's just starting to learn, it's a world where there's not many superheroes yet, he doesn't know what he's not even flying yet, he's doing the old-fashioned clearing a building with a run-up and a bound. But it pretty soon went, I think the best way to describe it went Grant Morrison. It started going in all sorts of interesting directions that I didn't really expect it to go at first.
Well, it mostly went that way at the end. I mean, the last 5 are quite twisty, but before that it was quite, honestly, I thought they were quite simple stories. And, it was one-off things, like the dog story, or like the story on Mars, even, that kicked it all off. So, but I always wanted to do something that would at least give us a little hint of Superman's life, since we created this new character, and he was a bit different from the Superman we've been familiar with. So this was a way of looking at all his life at once almost and using that as part of the bad guy's plan.
And of course you get to take him to one of the parallel Earths. We've got President Superman.
Yeah, of course. I mean, everybody loves a parallel Earth. We actually live in a parallel Earth,
When you start that sort of one, did you have the idea that you were going to explode out in those later issues, or did you start off writing it fairly straightforward as a reboot intro story and then get halfway through and think, you know what, this needs to open out, or was that always a plan, or was it something you just started to think?
I was only going to write 6 issues. I had this idea and I showed it to Dan DiDio, the publisher at DC, and he loved it. And my idea was just to introduce this new costume that Jim Lee had created. Because I said, I want to put him in jeans, and Dan said, it's a great idea, but Jim's created this new suit. and we don't want to tell him the guy's suddenly in jeans. So I'd suggested that let's show the transition between this jeans-wearing early Superman and the kind of more recognisable Silver Age Superman. So that's what I did, and it was just to show that transition. I'd have kept him in the jeans forever, and just had Superman in jeans, Superman in blue jeans forever. But I had to tie into this new costume, and that's what the story became. Was the transition between them.
That's something I guess you've really got to bear in mind when you're writing any of these characters for one of the big companies like DC or Marvel. It's not just you writing that. You've got to be aware that there's other things happening in other series that are all concurrent, they're all in the same universe, or they might be 2 or 3 years further down that universe in chronology, but what you do is going to have an effect. So how do you is there somebody that's looking after that all the time? Is there an editor that's saying, you can't have them doing this because somebody else is going to be doing that?
Yeah, there is an editor there, obviously. When I start these stories, like with Superman and Batman Incorporated, I wrote out a huge Superman in a 16-issue kind of overview. Once I got to issue 6 and realised I was going to do some more, I sent in the entire thing. So they knew what I was doing right up until the end. And the same went with Batman. But at the same time, with Batman, DC were trying to do something new. And Scott Snyder was kind of creating a new origin and a new take on Batman. So I really didn't want to get in the way of that, and I'd lasted long enough. So with Batman, it was definitely a sense of trying to finish something up and let the new thing breathe.
When you were talking Supergods, one of the things you were talking about, one of the themes in that one was that superheroes, obviously they've changed since the 1930s, and usually reflecting societal changes and interests. Where do you see them now? We're now well into the second sort of decade of the 21st century, the science fiction century. Where do you see superheroes in
right
this
now?
century?
And it's kind of sad almost. I'm getting bored with it. The superheroes have been soldiers for a long time, and we've made the mistake of confusing them with soldiers, which is why people are asking for Batman to kill the Joker or Superman to kill Zod, which is things that soldiers and members of the armed forces do. Not necessarily superheroes. I think vigilantes shouldn't really be encouraged to kill people. Perhaps I'm wrong there. Perhaps my morality is slightly skewed. But I don't think someone would. The minute Batman killed the Joker, Commissioner Gordon would arrest him. That's just the way it is, And the same goes for Superman. Really, for me, it's very strange to see all these superheroes being positioned as arms of the military-industrial complex, from Tony Stark and the Avengers. They're all soldiers now, and I think that's it's getting a bit tedious. I think we need to see the superhero maybe going back to just helping people or stopping bank robbers. But clearly, what we're looking for is the soldier in the threatening world that we live in. We're desperate for these people who are completely trained and can handle any terrible emergency and can get punched across the world without smarting. So I think they're going to be stuck there for a little while, at least until the West stops being so scared of itself.
I think that's a kind of post 9/11 thing, the same way that the original heroes were very 1940s. They're like, I'm going to go and punch Hitler.
No, it's a complete 9/11 thing. I think the superhero cinema of the West stands exactly in relation to 9/11 as the kaiju cinema of Japan stood in relation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think these things are all responses to trauma.
Moving away from the big boys in tights, got to bring this up. I'm sure a lot of you have been here for the last 2 events that Grant did here in the previous 2 years. He raised a certain lady. We asked him about it again last year. We're going to have to ask again because we all want to know. The Wonder Woman, what's happening with Wonder Woman? See, I told you they wanted to know.
No, I can finally admit to it now. It's happening. Yannick Paquette's drawn it. I'm sure people have seen some of the images. It's very, very beautiful book, and we're underway now. He's done about 27 pages out of 120. He's working steadily, so I expect it'll be next year.
This is going to be called The Trial?
It's The Trial of Diana Prince, and it's kind of, as I said in the papers, what I felt with Wonder Woman is she's constantly under the spotlight, she's constantly on trial, so I wanted to make that part of the actual meat of the story, where she's kind of defending what she's done to the Amazons, and a lot of different people come in as witnesses to her character.
How are you approaching the sexuality? I mean, you said here, but when the last couple of years when you were here, you were talking about the fact that obviously the original character, when Morrison created, was a real big, not just a sexual, I mean, there's practically an S&M thing going on in there.
See, I think
and you were saying
you
thought that's a real. You were saying that's something you think she's lost
Yeah.
in intervening years. The sexuality is an important concept, or important quality in it. How do you put that back in, and how do you do it without, getting sleazy or being,
Well, I mean, people see when they see the book, it's a tightrope you're walking to use these elements of bondage and chains and locks and recontextualise them and think, okay, the Amazons were enslaved by Hercules 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years later, all that streamed through this utopian culture. They have fantastic technology, they have amazing architecture, they have philosophy and music and art that's completely different from anything that's been influenced by men. So I think that it's, what was the start of that question? I've rambled.
about giving her back the sexuality, but without...
Yeah, so basically sexuality is part of that, and the notion, like, as I said before, if you're a bunch of immortal women on an island for 7,000 years, after 3,000 years you've pretty much done everything, In fact, you've done everything 1,000 times until it becomes really repetitive and weird. And that's what it is. Add another 4,000 years. So what we've created is a sexuality that's super bizarre and formal and ritualised. It involves all these bits and pieces of S&M iconography, like chains, but it completely paints it in a new way. I think it's kind of, I don't want to spend too much on it because it will preempt how it feels to read this, but yeah.
Well, moving to something else, I know you're returning to one of your past characters. Maybe not as famous as Superman, but I know he's one that you're fond of, and a lot of readers have got a fondness for. You're going back to doing Sea Guy?
Oh yeah, Sea Guy, he's my favourite. So
what have you got lined up this time?
It's the final book, Sea Guy Eternal, and it's kind of, the first book was about childhood and the follies of childhood, and the second book was like being a teenager and rebelling against and seeing through the lies of society, and the third book is about adulthood and death, kind of. So it's about maturity, and it's basically Sea Guy going on a big adventure to Australia, which is all that remains of Australia, and it's now 1,001 broken islands, because that's where the monster Antidad fell at the end of the superhero age. So it's on a big kind of Jason and the Argonauts quest, and Cameron Stewart just finally got the script. I finished it months ago, and then we see him online saying, I haven't seen this thing. And then I saw a news item today, and it's artist receives Sea Guy script. Well, that's fucking important. So Mubarak found hanged, artist receives Seaman's.
There you go, comics are big news these days. You just have to look at the amount of events we've got here.
Oh yeah.
One of the other things...
Everybody loves the graphic novels these days.
Yeah, sequential graphical art.
I think we were right all along.
One of the other things you brought up in some of your previous events, you were saying that you thought the pendulum between writers and artists had swung a bit too much in recent years, where now the writers maybe a bit too much, and the artist is kind of just being brought in almost for hire. And you were saying you really thought the artists should be, instead of giving them as much visual direction on a script, you should be saying, I shall leave it to them. They're the visual creators, they're the experts on visual layout. Leave it to them. How you do? Are you still trying to do that?
No, I think a lot of them actually reacted to that, even if it wasn't them reacting to me. They reacted against a certain approach to comics, which was the cinematic four-panel, that grid, the proscenium arch of the cinema. And a lot of people reacted against it. Chris Burnham's Batman Incorporated used a lot more tiny panels and fragments, and he was thinking about, again, looking at sort of video imagery rather than cinema, which has been something that comics have been doing for a long time, is looking at cinema, but there's a lot of other visual arts, a lot of other interesting things to look at, which can inspire page layouts. So that's what he was doing, and I think, other people like Yannick Paquette's doing all this beautiful decorative work, the kind of J.H. Williams style, where panels are surrounded by, motifs or visual ideas. So there's a lot of people, I think, that starting to stretch a little bit over the last year. I've noticed it in a bunch of the comics,
So there's been quite a few recently doing lovely layouts.
And the stuff in the Scott Snyder Batman by Greg Capullo. They're trying things, or the people are starting to try things a little bit.
I noticed even in the new 52 Flash, the opening sequence, and they had the action panels actually inside the big logo of the Flash. And it looked like something fun from the 70s. It was a really nice, enjoyable layout. Which obviously that brings us on to one of your favourite characters, I know, the Flash.
The Flash, good old
You still
Flash.
get a hankering to go back to the Flash?
Yeah, I'd still like to do it sometime. I've told them I want to do it, but it's the same story I wanted to do for years, so everybody's heard it already. Just want to do the Flash getting faster and faster. It's really simple. Like, the Fly, like he's turning into a fly, or Incredible Shrinking Man where he's getting smaller. just do the story about this guy getting faster and it's uncontrollable, and how that would affect your relationships and your life, and not make it a superhero story at all. Just make a big science fiction story about a super speed guy.
The other thing that's all mentioned recently you're going to be involved with is this big multiversity. A mini-series you're telling me?
It's a sort of, what's between a mini-series and a maxi-series? Sort of, I don't know, a multi-series or something. It's 9 issues, and each one's set in a different parallel universe. Each one's drawn by a different artist. So we got things like, the Nazi Superman, but I wanted to take that away from the idea of, we've seen these things before, like Earth X in the old DC Comics continuity was a world where the Nazis had won the war, and these freedom fighter quality characters were fighting Nazi robots and this kind of android Hitler had been in charge for 50 years. So I thought it'd be more interesting to look at what would happen to a Nazi culture, like, all these years after the war, where superheroes had kind of worked for the Nazis. At least there's one. Superman's landed in the Sudetenland. He becomes a Nazi soldier, basically. He doesn't really know what he's working for. And many years later now, there's this utopia, but it's a really grotesque, sentimental Nazi 1930s utopia with fantastic soaring architecture and bases on the moon. But underneath it, there's a kind of corruption, this hopeless, horrible basis in genocide. So the Superman of this world actually wants it all to end, and when these terrorists start to appear, led by Uncle Sam, and they're kind of the huddled masses of America suddenly start to strike back, he kind of do I fight them, or do I let this corrupt system fall apart? So we kind of things like that. Each one of them's got a different take. Frank Wiley's doing the kind of Charlton characters in the style of Watchmen, but instead of the 9-panel grids, we're doing 8-panel grids based on musical harmonics. So we're kind of taking a lot of the techniques of Watchmen that Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons did and trying to rethink them and do something modern with them. So I don't think, for easily understandable reasons, because it's like doing calculus, as I've said before, to create a comic that's so intricately, every panel is connected. And no one's done it for a long time, so we thought it'd be fun to do it with the original Charlton characters and have a murder, but instead of the murder of the comedian, which opens the Watchmen, but we have the assassination of the president and suddenly the investigation of this. So it's a little bit of that, and a little bit of Citizen Kane in there. So as I say, each one of them's got its own tone. Cameron Stewart's doing Captain Marvel.
Different artists in each one.
And he's finished his Captain Marvel book, it just looks fantastic. So it's kind of a big kind of kaleidoscopic take on the DC multiverse.
I know fine well, there's probably a million questions people here want to ask, so
go for it.
We're going to go over to let you have your chance. If you could wait until the chap with the microphone comes up to you. Who are we going for first? Oh, I think that was the first hand. Get you to say.
Hiya. I heard in the Kevin Smith podcast that you did, you talk very favourably about some of your favourite comics that you've read as a child. What was the last comic that you've read recently that you really enjoyed that wasn't your own sort of thing?
Oh God, I always forget. Every time I'm reading a comic, I just think I've got to remember this. Next time somebody says, what comics do you read? I'll be able to say, I don't know, I read all the DC comics in the bath because they send them to me. So it'll be one of those. The Scott Snyder stuff, I've really been enjoying what he's been doing, and there's tons of stuff. Michael Cooperman, the guy who does that Thrizzle thing, that's my favourite comic of all. But they don't come out that often. But yeah, Scott Snyder, Jeff Johns, DC Comics, I kind of like that stuff. But I used to like Green Lantern, but now he's moved on. I really liked Green Lantern when it was like Star Trek and it was all interconnected and it was Jon Stewart and all these guys. Before he became a rainbow. No, he was fine as a rainbow. It's just it was kind of I was following that whole Jeff Johns continuity, and it's gone now. It's kind of moved on.
I think we had somebody up just over on the left there.
Hi, could you tell us what your experience was at Morrison Con?
Oh yeah, Morrison Con's been since the last time I was here. It was actually really good. I had no idea what to expect, but it was good. People were just doing their own thing, which is what I'd hoped. And there was like kids getting married, and getting tattoos and like people getting beaten up in the strip. So it was an experience for folk. It was I kind of enjoyed it. It was different from what I imagined it would be, but I'll never do it again. It had to be a one-off, unrepeatable experience.
Staying in Vegas then, is it? Stays in
It
Vegas.
stays in Vegas, yes. Vegas stays in Vegas.
Who's next?
Who else?
Dealer's choice.
I know who's choosing. Hi.
Hi Grant, are you missing
Hey.
Batman?
Am I missing Batman? Yeah, kind of, but there's also part of me is really glad it's done. I have to say, you know, I don't have that hectoring voice in my head anymore in the morning. Come on, you better go for a run. Okay, Bruce.
Do you get to keep the utility belt when you finish writing Batman, or do you have to give it back?
No, you have to give it back. What can Batman do without it? You put extra stuff in it, you know. Like lentils.
Who's next?
Yeah, about multiversity. I remember reading an interview at one point where you talked about how one of the multiversity books was going to be a haunted comic book.
Yeah,
And
it is.
I was wondering, like, what constitutes a haunted comic? How would
Well,
you
I
pull
can't
that
tell
off?
you, because if I tell you, somebody else will steal it. It's such a good. Honestly, this is like, it's really simple, and you just go, oh, Phil, well, that's all right, okay. Shit, I'm possessed. So honestly, but it's a technique. It's like if I tell it, people will be able to use it.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just curious. As everyone knows that you worked on 52 with 3 other writers, I was just curious, what was your experience like working with a sort of larger group where everybody had to contribute to different stories, and what storylines in that book do you feel you contribute the most to?
Well, we all had our own little bits and pieces. So I did the space story, and I did the Metal Men story with Dr. Magnus, and I did an issue with the elongated man in Tibet. So we kind of had our own strands, you know. Matt Wade always did the elongated man story, or Jeff Johns always did the Black Adam story. So we kind of had quite defined strands, and we really swapped over. So I really enjoyed it. I wouldn't want to do it all the time, but it's great to work with other people and see how they think and how they organise their stories.
I think we need to get somebody from this side of the
Yeah,
audience.
over here.
I heard a story that you had pitched a Superman pitch to Warner Brothers, and well, they didn't accept it obviously. But I was wondering, are you allowed to talk about it, and can you tell us what the pitch was?
I don't know if I am actually, but yeah, I mean, I was.
Don't tell anybody he said it.
Anyway, No, I worked as a consultant at Warner's for a couple of years with Mark Wolfman and Jeff Johns. So we were all pitching stuff all the time, and they brought us in to talk to executives about comic characters and how they worked. And it was kind of, honestly, it was a strange experience, because you would go in and explain Wonder Woman to people and explain Superman to them, and they'd all take notes. And I felt that nothing was actually getting through. And there was a sense that it was a kind of vacuum activity almost. So I did a bunch of pitches for Aquaman and for Flash and a bunch of other things, but none of them were ultimately ever used. But you know, we got paid very well. It was fun, but they weren't used. And I think it's kind of natural. It's weird to bring in writers from another place and then expect a director and his writer to come in and listen to anything they've got to say, because directors and the writers tend to have their own ideas of what they want to do, and usually those ideas make sense within the context of, you know, how Hollywood works. I think we were coming with a very different mindset.
Do you think these guys actually even know what you're talking about? I mean, do they know these characters at all, or
They
to them
don't,
it's just purely a property they can?
Yeah,
they
a
want
lot
to
of them are
manufacture?
not that familiar with them, and certainly they're only familiar with them in terms of their own childhood. Even. So you do have to explain things. You know, why does Superman look that way? Well, it's his clothes. You know? why does Santa Claus look that way? But you know, and you explain all the reasons. He's a circus strongman, and the cape came from here, and the boots came from here. But that doesn't really get across to them. And I think you have to be David Goyer and Zack Snyder to really come in there and say, here's how it's done.
Of course, they need to get into a good position about. They have to make big films before they
Yeah,
can trust you with that sort of
and
film.
because they've already done it, they'll be listened to.
So that's hopefully improving things. Who's next on this side? Somebody over for this side, maybe? Jump up. Oh, where is it? Somebody up the back, the Space Invaders t-shirt. Can't ignore a t-shirt like that.
Thanks. Listening to the Fat Man on Batman podcast, you mentioned that when you're at home, you act out the characters that you've written out.
Shut up, you. No, I don't.
I've got two questions. Who's your favourite character to act out whilst you're making the tea and the toast, etc.? And would you consider...
Who's that one? Casanova.
Would you consider playing this role in a live action movie?
I definitely, I think I'd make a really good, who would I make a really good?
What?
Who's that sort of Wolverine's son, or Wolverine's dad, I think. No, honestly, I'm quite good at improvisation, but I don't think I could actually learn any lines to play anybody in a movie, so not a chance. Who's that? I'd Lex Luthor, I could get him. Now you're fucked,
I think the other part of that one was asking
You
about
see, the
when you're
toilet
play
seat
acting.
was green kryptonite.
That's a low blow.
Nasty.
No wonder the man wears his pants on the outside.
Red line.
I think the other part of that question he was asking that do you look in the mirror, do you play act any of it out when you're thinking it in your head?
Stop
You got
talking
favourite?
about it.
That's alright, that's
Well,
research,
you
that's
want
not
me
play
to go up,
acting,
you
it's
just want me to
researching.
go up and say, this city stinks. It reeks of hate and shame and hate. And it takes a man like me. You know, honestly, is this what you want to hear? That this is what I do with my time?
He's saying the rumours that your toaster ejects batarang-shaped toast is not true then?
No, my toaster comes back and goes, ha 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 ha, Batman!
Somebody up the back here?
You mentioned Ben Affleck. What do you think of him playing the next Batman?
What do you think about... I didn't hear the end of that, say that. What do you think about Ben Affleck?
The casting.
Again, I said, well, let's see the performance. Nobody believed Michael Keaton could do Batman. They did a great job, so it's really down to... Yes, I've got a little hand out for Michael Keaton. And honestly, it's down to the performance. But as I say, we've seen him as Daredevil, so like, all you have to do is get a felt pen and colour that in. And that's pretty much what he's going to look like, so... Oh, he's been Superman as well. The guy's been ill, he's all Superman.
He's paid his dues, he's paid his dues.
So give him a chance, I say.
Good. Somebody just on the third row back there, just thank you.
Hi, you've mentioned before, I think, your mega Batman saga originally began with the idea for the Batman RIP line. Now, it's last maybe 6-7 years, but at what point, how many stages were you thinking, I'm going to add another long chapter to this? And it was like, you thought, oh, I'm getting to the end of RIP, but I will then launch Batman and Robin.
Yeah.
But then did you have Batman Inc. at the back of your mind when you're thinking next Batman and Robin, or how did this 7-year process evolve? That's what I'm trying to ask.
I got to the end of Batman RIP and then suddenly thought, wouldn't it be great if Batman went away for a little bit? Because now we've kind of made that possible. So if he goes away, that means I can do Dick Grayson, and then suddenly I've got Damien here. So it seemed to make an awful lot of sense to put those two characters together. And then they worked really well together, and as I've said, I could have done that for a long, long time. But DC quite rightly wanted to make sure that Bruce Wayne was back and that people, understood that Bruce Wayne was always going to be Batman. So I was working on that stuff, and I thought, well, Bruce is going to come back. How do I deal with that? And suddenly I remember sitting on a plane coming home from America just thinking, okay, Batman Incorporated, what if he comes back and kind of franchises the whole operation? So once I had that idea, it just naturally spread into the couple of years that I did it, and that was it. But these things just suggested themselves in each case at the end of the story that I was working on.
Somebody in the front row here?
Well, you usually often conceive alien eerie with creatures, entities, and places. How do you usually conceive them? Have you got inspiration about thinking?
About aliens and things. It's just, honestly, it's just stretching your imagination. It really is, and also being interested in the occult and having direct contact with things that look a bit peculiar is is very inspirational.
You're not just talking about being out on a Saturday night in Glasgow, there, are you?
No, well, that goes without saying. No, I'm talking about the denizens of the tunnels of Set.
It's the same thing again.
In some ways, denizens of the tunnels of Sucky Hall Street. But no, it's just the exercise of imagination. You know, I like to think of villains and monsters, and each one you try to think of something new. Like in the Multiversity, I think the monster we've come up with is quite unusual. It's a completely new kind of thing. And so stuff like that, I like to just stretch a little bit beyond what's possible. But you know, basic monster ultimately they're still fighting a monster, but it's a different take on a monster. So honestly, all these things are just imagination. You're just pushing yourself to think of the next bizarre creature that would be useful to put up against your hero.
You got any favourite monsters yourself? I mean, not just from comic films or anything. Is there one that's an old fave?
The Zante Misfits. No, we were talking about them today. These little things from the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits, and the little ants, but they've got human faces. Oh, it's seriously
very
disturbing.
creepy looking.
Yeah, they're horrible. But they're little masks, like African masks, or something really creepy looking things. So the Zante Misfits, I'm a bit worried about them.
Sounds like a good name for a 70s punk band, man.
It was actually a name for an 80s band, an indie band, so yeah, you were right.
Who's next? Here we go.
Hi.
We're over the bottom.
Yeah.
They're ahead of us,
Hey. I had a question about Damien.
Yeah?
So I read your quote, well, what you said on Wikipedia about him dying an absolute hero.
Uh-huh.
Do you think there's any chance of him, sort of doing a Jason Todd's Back from the Dead resurrection sort of thing?
I'm sure there is. I mean, it won't have anything to do with me, but yeah, I mean, there's no character can be kept down. You know, the grave is no object in comics. If you've been buried, you can be as sure that you'll bust out of that earth within 6 months. So honestly, I think inevitably you will see him again, but I don't know where or when.
As Joss Whedon had them saying Buffy once, death's not the end, not for people like us.
No, absolutely,
it's
it's true.
Nobody totally dies in sci-fi or
And I
comics.
think people, again, it's like part of the thing for the comics for me is that I don't take them seriously as anything that could ever happen in real life. I don't believe there could ever be a Batman or a Superman or any of these things. So when I'm writing those characters from DC or Marvel, I'm actually writing about what the reality of them. And the reality of them is that they're made out of paper. You know, I've said this before, that the real truth of Superman that he's paper or he's celluloid, and it has to be taken into consideration. You know, that's how I felt when I ended the Batman run, was the sense that Batman can't end. There's no end to this, and it's always been handed on to someone else, and it has to be acknowledged. He's not a real human being. He's still the same age he was in 1939. This guy isn't going to die. So when you're dealing with something that's textually, he's not human. The superhero is this construct that's made of paper and light, and it seems to be much more interesting to talk about that stuff, about the longevity of these characters, or the tendency that they have to cycle through the same types of stories again. And I don't think that's necessarily even a bad thing. I think it's a condition of being trapped in myth, where you never age and your stories are constantly recycled by each new generation. And that's what I like to talk about in comics. I can't talk about Batman being a real guy in Gotham City. That can't happen. You know? So I have to talk about him as a cultural object, and that's why my stories somehow also tend to be about the idea of Batman and not just about the character.
I think Supergod, you pretty much said yourself, it's almost like long before we had virtual reality, the comics were a kind of form of paper virtual reality.
Yeah, and they were
these people, they can only work in their own little world that you've created.
And they're complete universes, and they last for decades, generations.
We all buy into it. We all love it. Why do we all buy into it?
You know, and we don't need them to be real. We don't want Batman to stop being Bruce Wayne ultimately. So he's always going to be Bruce Wayne.
Some folk down the front here, I think. Oh, right here in the front. Oh, this first.
Hi. Was Batcow your idea?
What do you think? Yeah, Batcow is my idea, but apparently there was already a Batcow in one of those Tiny Titans or something, wasn't it? They introduced their own different version of Batcow. But yeah, but Batcow was it was an idea whose time had come. It's like steam engine time. It's like Batcow time, and obviously he's in a new comic as well. Other people are writing about Batcow now. That's how potent and important that character is.
Is there any plans to have a Batman ice cream coming from Batman?
No, but the next film is Superman Batcow. You get it, it's not Batman, that actually means
I imagine Hollywood would just milk that one.
Absolutely. He'd be good at that. He could pull that off, couldn't he?
Would someone down the front here? Right.
Some of my favorite stuff that you've written is like Marvel Boy and like all these characters that are like and New X-Men and even to an extent the New Superman where it's like these rebellious characters that and like inciting revolution and stuff like that. And what's like, why does that appeal to you? Like, why do you love to write and how are you so good at writing these revolution sort of stories?
I grew up with my father who was a kind of revolutionary character, so I guess part of my life was about going to protest marches and doing all that stuff, so it always appealed to me, heroes who were anti-authoritarian or anti-establishment. But as you get older, you're also thinking, well, inevitably you kind of become the establishment, so I always like going back to these guys and reminding myself how I felt when I was a little bit younger, so Superman fitted into that, and Marvel Boy's the same, they kind of, it always appeals to me, just people just kick traces over and set fire to things and blow them up. And I know it's wrong, and the older I get, the more I'm just like, no, that's wrong. But it kind of excites me when a warehouse blows up.
Leading from that, when you were doing the Action Comics reboot, it's quite early on when you've got Superman, the authorities are just finding out they don't like the idea of the super guy running around. But the people, he quite quickly becomes a people's hero. Is that something that you were kind of maybe going through the same kind of up years authority, the people on the street like him?
And it's how he started, was the champion of the oppressed and the champion of the people. And it just seemed that was a good way of getting him away from the whole military thing again, and making him quite obviously anti that, but being smart enough and being strong enough to just, to take the piss out of the soldiers, accept that they exist. Planet Earth needs this, obviously, for this time in its development. But he's not, I wanted him not to be that kind of military, industrial, patriarchal dad Superman that he'd been for a while.
It's kind of almost the opposite. I mean, it's Luthor that's tied up with the military industrial and it's not that one.
Yeah, which makes more sense.
Yeah.
It's baddie, It's like he thinks all that stuff's cool.
Would somebody just in the second row there?
Hey, how are you doing?
Hiya.
I got a question. I have a 6-year-old, and we always go watch comic book movies, and we also read comic books now. And the biggest thing she's always asking about the bad guys, why are they bad? She doesn't take that at face value. So I try to elaborate, so do you think it's important that when you write a villain that you make them, more complex, or basically you can empathize with them to understand why they make those decisions? Basically why the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Sometimes I think that's good, and sometimes I think the stories demand just a clear Manichaean black and white thing, I kind of like to write cackling, monstrous villains as well, and I kind of, in superhero comics, I tend to do that more, because to me the hero represents an absolute, and the villain also represents an absolute. And again, because I'm not trying to pretend that these people could ever be real, they can be allowed to be symbolic or to be archetypal in that way. So I don't mind that, but yeah, I mean, it's also good to write a villain with motivations, and I think all villains should have a reason for what they do. I really enjoyed writing Luthor in All-Star Superman because he had a point, and you're kind of agreeing with him slightly, and you think, yeah, I might think that myself, but at the same time you can see where he's gone off the rails with that, and it's pretty obvious. But something like the Joker, the Joker should always be done in a terrifying, he doesn't think like any of us, and the closer we get to how he thinks, the more disturbing and unpleasant it becomes. So I don't know if we really need to see a caring, sharing portrayal of how he became the Joker, although there have been good versions of that, but it's not essential. When the Joker first appeared, he had no backstory, he was just this figure, this terrifying nightmare. So I think it can go both ways, honestly. I think certain stories demand the villain to be complex, and it makes a lot of sense, but in other cases you want to see figures out of nightmare, and the sort of creatures that you face in your dreams, which are quite clearly representative of absolute evil or absolute greed or absolute hatred.
Is that what you were going with Arkham Asylum? Because that's, for my money, that's one of the most disturbing depictions of the Joker, and just not just the criminal gene, but it's madness. I mean, it's nightmares cracking open the skull on a bad night, kind of.
Yeah, I mean that's what it was, and each of them were a kind of different complex as well, like Batman's hero villains are. But yeah, I mean, I think it's okay to sometimes play them purely as symbols and purely as abstract.
I'm sure we'll play plenty more here.
The girls had their hands up 100 times. Hey!
Sorry.
Thanks. And this is kind of an esoteric question, but I've been sort of heard a little bit about your interest in the occult and things like that, and I was just thinking about that in terms of like a large part of that would be like magic alphabets and sigils and stuff. But do you think that comic books, in a way, because they kind of combine image and word, because I've got a copy of the Invisibles here, I'm thinking, is that like, because it combines those two things, maybe that's a really interesting vehicle to work out these ideas through?
No, absolutely, and I'd come up with the notion of what I called the hyper sigil, which was to extend the sigil through the fourth dimension and add elements of plot and movement and duration. Because prior to that, sigils were flat two-dimensional representations of ideas condensed down into a hieroglyph. But I thought there was a way of extending that and implicating the magician even more deeply in the creation of a work, so that you're actually inhabiting a world. And with the Invisibles, I was getting all kinds of weird feedback that knocked me into hospital and stuff like that. So I found that it was a pretty effective way to work. And I think that I'd like to see more idea, the hypersigil idea tried out more. A lot of people are doing things, but it'd be good to see dances, and movies and anything that's an extended artwork that carries a magical intent can be seen as a hypersigil. So yeah, I definitely think comics are a really good vehicle for it, specifically because of the combination of words and images, which activates the entire brain, activates left and right hemispheres simultaneously, and there's a weird kind of holographic effect, which makes comics come to life, because comics shouldn't, all they are is paper and ink. They shouldn't be able to make you cry or get you excited. But when consciousness interacts with them, the thing takes on a four-dimensional quality, a realism. The little crappy drawings can become really potent and important.
I was here last week, I'm sure a lot of you were, for the Chris Ware and Joe Sacco event. One of the things that Ware was talking about was the way some of the comics, you can make them he was saying very three-dimensional, in your case probably fourth-dimensional. Do you think that's something you can do really well with a medium, that you don't just, as you say, have a flat page? It ends up reconstructing itself inside your head afterwards. You really get right into the reader's head.
You bring these flat images to life, but even the page itself, I'm still wanting to see more people explore the idea of the page having depth, which Frank Whiteley and I were trying to do in We 3, where you had the notion that it's not a flat surface, it could be an infinite depth. So you can stack panels, you can rotate panels within that space, that three-dimensional page space. And I'd like to see more people trying that stuff, because I think there's a lot to be discovered and a lot of interesting things to be worked out by trying experiments in that area.
You ever moved to try and do something like that in the new digital platforms, where you can actually take advantage of the fact you can do mixed media?
Yeah, I mean, I've got ideas for that, but I said that last year, it still hasn't happened, so it's one of those things that will come in the future. But I've got a lot of ideas of how you would adapt that platform to make comics work.
Somebody up the back with a chance.
Right, man. Just basically, I'm surprised nobody's asking you about Kathmandu yet. Because that melted my mind, and I would like to hear some more. Just like I've heard it in the podcast, I've read it in the book, and I just want to see you telling us about it, because I'm your new apostle.
Well, this is like greatest hits. This is like singing My Way for me, I'll try and do it quite quickly. I went to Kathmandu, and the idea was basically to achieve enlightenment, because we'd seen it on telly. And there's this guy, Dan Cruikshank, who does these TV shows. So he was basically in Kathmandu, and he's following the footsteps of the Buddha through India, the whole thing. And he gets to this temple in the Kathmandu Valley called Swayambanath, and there's 360 stairs, So there's one stair for each day, 365 stairs, one day for each day of the year. And Dan Cruikshank says this is the ultimate holy spot on earth. Any devotion performed here is 9 billion times more effective than anywhere else on the planet. Okay, that sounds pretty impressive. And if you can go up these stairs in one breath, you're guaranteed enlightenment in this life. So that seemed a lot much easier work than actually going and meditating or anything. So we figured let's just go and run up the stairs. And I went across with my mate. We just got a ticket and went to Kathmandu. And as I say, it's very easy to do. You know, we were young guys. We just took a deep breath and ran up the stairs. So we thought, this is it. This is sorted. Let's go home, mate. But then the next day, I'd actually sitting in the roof garden. I was writing stuff for the Invisibles. You know, I was writing a story for the back for the second issue, and this thing started to happen. And as I always say, and I've got to caveat this because I did take this tiny little piece of hash. But you know, and yeah, I would laugh too. But the weird thing was, the effect of whatever happened didn't correlate to this tiny little bit of hash. You know, I've tried a lot of this stuff, particularly after that. I pretty much tried every psychedelic available to see if I could recreate this, and never could get close to it on anything, even DMT, high dose mushrooms, tryptamine. None of it took me back to this place. So I had to conclude that something else had happened, and because it changed my perspective so powerfully and violently, it became like absolutely real to me. But what happened was, I'm sitting up in the roof garden writing this thing, and suddenly the Swayambana temple at the end of the valley starts transforming, and it seemed to be, there was like pipes coming out the back. It was like spiritual energy was venting, and I thought, I'm really hallucinating here, this is bizarre. So I tried to make it downstairs, got downstairs, my pal's lying over there sick in bed, and I lay back in bed. Oh Jesus Christ, this is hardcore. And I'm lying there, and these blobs come out the walls, like silver blobby things, you know, like raised things, like bits of mercury floating in anti-gravity. And they were kind of like communicating. They just said, okay, you fucking asked for it. So now what do you want to do? And I said, well, where do you want to go? Alpha Centauri. First thing that came into my head. If somebody ever says to you, where do you want to go? Don't make that the first thing. You know, say like the Playboy Mansion. It's just something else, Buckingham Palace. But no, I said Alpha Centauri. And honestly, this thing happened where I stopped feeling my body, and this kind of Stargate stuff, and then a perfect astronomical representation of Alpha Centauri with 3 suns, all correct, all in the right place on a kind of planet. They took me down to this planet. I got into a bit of an altercation with these things that seemed to be made in neon tubes, fanning, and so I put them in Superman, the All-Star Superman. I called them the electro kind. But there was the idea that they were tungsten glass aliens and these brittle exoskeletons. So it was all super convincing. They were communicating these angry, like, making shapes. They pulled me out of there, and then they said, you're too dangerous to be going into anybody else's culture. You're just an idiot. You went in there and really offended those glass tube people.
Maybe fit in one last
yeah,
question.
We haven't even finished this.
we're running out of time.
This guy's waiting for the big
He's waiting for enlightenment.
So very quickly, you know, if you can read
Fuck him, it's alright, just tell me.
So they just said, look, we'll show you this is what we brought you here for. We're going to forget time and space. We're going to turn you around and show you everything else. And they turned me around, and I saw a higher dimensional space, and all of the 4-dimensional space-time continuum from the beginning to the end was a single object. Like, it was like rotating sphincters is all I can remember, like coming in and out of each other. But you could see Shakespeare was there, and the dinosaurs were there. Everything was happening at the same time on this object, and we were outside it. And they showed me this kind of sort of blue vaulted space with silver traces going through it. And these silver things would plug into the grid. And when they plugged into the grid, they would interact, they would receive information. They basically just said, this is what we live, we're kind of like dolphins, but we swim in information. All we do is create. And what we do is create universes, because only by creating time can we grow our young. We live in a world beyond time and space. Time and space is just a very small component of our world, but everything here is immanent, is permanent. So we can't grow children unless we build a little time and space thing. And that was our universe. Right? And so they said, this is what we do, we put a larva into this little thing, this terrarium, this universarium, and in time it's capable of growth, because only in time, as I say, can things grow. And that's, so they show me all this massive, and they just say, you've got to go back now and try and explain this. I'm like, fuck you. And, you know, there was a bit more to it, but that was kind of the gist of this. It was this big thing that said, the object that lives on the planet Earth, it's a singular object. If you track through, as I've said this 1,000 times, if you track everybody's timeline out this door, they all go back through history to the single mitochondrial cell in the ocean 3.5 billion years ago. We're all connected intrinsically. And it can even, if you think about that, we're actually like a giant anemone. It's all the little parts of it. Every living thing is actually connected to one root. And if you see it with time taken away, it's all one thing. It's here all the time. We're all part of it. So they just basically, there's one thing that lives on the planet Earth. It's been growing for a long time. It's getting to a point now that it's reaching enormous complexity, and it's about to become adult. And when it becomes adult, you'll better be ready for it. And it just said, it was another one, was like everyone who has these experiences, these kind of holy guardian angel or UFO abduction or, you know, higher contact experiences, gets this same shit. It's like, something's coming, something very important's coming, some big change is coming. It never seems to come, you know, but it's the message is always, there's something very important happening and you have to be part of it and go home and tell everyone. And everyone who does this seems to receive the same information, which is why a lot of people mistake it. They come back and think, they've learned this big thing, you know, all is one. So then they come home and think, all is one, I am one. Hey, I am the one! And that's how you get messiahs, and that's how you get Neo from the Matrix. You know, but basically what you're actually learning is everything is one, it's all connected. And it's why people can remember being Napoleon, because right now Napoleon's sitting on Elba in another century. Right now, you at 6 years old is thinking about eating a cake, you know. It's all happening in this object. It's just we can't move in time, so we don't see it in its entirety. And if that explains anything, it's kind of.
Grant will be signing shortly after the event. Enlightenment, however, is your own prerogative. You'll have to find out yourself. You all join me in thanking Grant Morrison for coming along.